The Arizona desert stretched endlessly under a merciless sun, where heat waves danced like ghosts across the red earth. Jack Morrison's weathered hands gripped the barn door handle, the metal burning through his leather gloves. At 52, his face bore the deep lines of a man who'd learned to expect nothing from the world but dust and disappointment. The barn smelled of hay and horse sweat, familiar scents that usually brought him comfort. But today, something felt different. His mare, Sage, stood restlessly in her stall, ears twitching toward the back corner where the old hay bales were stacked. "Easy, girl," Jack murmured, his voice rough from years of talking only to animals. "What's got you spooked?" As he moved deeper into the barn, a slight rustling made him freeze. Rats, maybe, or a snake seeking shade from the desert heat. He'd dealt with both before. But then he saw her. A young Apache girl, no more than 14, crouched behind the hay bales like a wounded animal. Her dark hair was matted with dust and sweat, her traditional dress torn and stained. But it was her eyes that stopped him cold, wide with terror, yet holding a fierce dignity that reminded him of someone he'd lost long ago. She pressed herself further into the shadows, clutching something wrapped in cloth to her chest. Jack could see her trembling, whether from fear or exhaustion, he couldn't tell. "Hey there," he said softly, the way he'd approach a skittish horse. "You're safe now." The girl's eyes darted toward the barn door, calculating her chances of escape. Jack slowly crouched down, keeping his distance, making himself less threatening. "Nobody's gonna hurt you here," he continued, his voice gentler than it had been in years. "You hungry?" At the mention of food, her composure cracked slightly. She pressed a hand to her stomach, and Jack caught the hollow look in her cheeks that spoke of days without proper meals. Something inside his chest tightened, a feeling he'd buried 3 years ago when they lowered his daughter Sarah's coffin into the ground. Sarah, who would have been about this girl's age now. Sarah, who used to hide in this very barn when she was scared. "Come on out, daughter." The word slipped from his lips before he could stop it, spoken with a tenderness that surprised them both. "Let's get you something to eat." The girl's eyes widened at the unexpected gentleness, the English word she clearly understood. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, slowly, she began to emerge from her hiding place. Jack stood carefully, not wanting to startle her. "That's it. Nice and easy." As she stepped into the light, he could see she was older than he'd first thought, maybe 16 or 17, but malnourished and exhausted. The bundle she carried was wrapped in what looked like traditional Apache fabric, decorated with intricate beadwork. "I'm Jack," he said, pointing to himself. "Jack Morrison. This is my place." She stared at him for a long moment, then spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "Ayanna." The name hung in the air between them like a bridge being built, one plank at a time. "Ayanna," Jack repeated, testing the unfamiliar syllables. "That's a pretty name. You got somewhere to go, Ayanna? Family looking for you?" The girl's face closed off immediately, fear flickering back into her eyes. She shook her head quickly, clutching her bundle tighter. Jack felt a familiar ache in his chest, the recognition of someone running from something they couldn't face. He'd been running himself for 3 years, ever since the fever took Sarah and left him alone in this desert wasteland. "Well," he said, surprising himself with the decision forming in his mind, "looks like you found yourself a place to stay, at least for tonight." As the sun began to set, painting the barn walls in shades of gold and amber, Jack Morrison looked at the frightened Apache girl and saw something he thought he'd lost forever, a chance to be more than just a man waiting to die. 2 weeks had passed since Ayanna's arrival, and the ranch had begun to feel different. The silence that once felt like a shroud now held the comfortable rhythm of 2 people learning to coexist. Jack had set up a cot in the spare room, the room that used to be Sarah's, And though Ayana had initially refused to sleep indoors, preferring the barn, she'd gradually begun to trust the small sanctuary he offered. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen window as Jack prepared breakfast. He'd learned that Ayana preferred her eggs scrambled soft, that she had a sweet tooth for the honey he drizzled over biscuits, and that she watched his every movement with the careful attention of someone who'd learned that survival depended on reading people correctly. "Coffee's ready," Jack said, pouring 2 cups. He'd started making it weaker since she'd arrived. She was still too young for the bitter brew that had sustained him through countless lonely mornings. Ayana appeared in the doorway, her long black hair now clean and braided, wearing one of Sarah's old dresses that Jack had hesitantly offered. It was too big, but she'd accepted it with a quiet dignity that made his throat tight. "Thank you," she said, her English improving daily. She had a quick mind and an ear for language that impressed him. They ate in comfortable silence, a routine they'd developed. Jack had learned not to ask too many questions. Ayana would share what she was ready to share, when she was ready. But this morning, something was different. She kept glancing toward the window, tension radiating from her small frame. "You expecting someone?" Jack asked, following her gaze to the empty desert beyond. Ayana's hand stilled on her coffee cup. "My people, they look for me." It was the most she'd said about her past since arriving. Jack set down his fork, giving her his full attention. "They want to take you back?" "They want..." She struggled with the words, then switched to a mix of English and what Jack assumed was Apache. "Arranged marriage. Old man. Many horses for my father." Jack's jaw tightened. He'd heard stories, knew that some of the traditional ways were hard on young women, especially in these changing times when the old world was colliding with the new. "You don't want that," he said. It wasn't a question. Ayana shook her head vehemently. "I want to learn, to read books, to choose my own path." Her voice grew stronger with conviction. "Like white women do." Jack leaned back in his chair, studying her face. There was steel beneath that youthful exterior, a determination that reminded him painfully of Sarah's stubborn streak. "Reading, huh?" he said finally. "Well, I got some books. Not many, but enough to start." Her eyes lit up with an excitement that transformed her entire face. "You would teach me?" "If you want to learn." Jack stood, walking to the small bookshelf in the corner. Most of the volumes were practical, veterinary guides, farming manuals, but there were a few of Sarah's favorites. "My daughter, she loved to read." He pulled out a worn copy of Little Women and placed it gently in Ayana's hands. She cradled it like something precious, running her fingers over the faded cover. "She was about your age," Jack continued, his voice rough. "Fever took her 3 winters ago." Ayana looked up at him with understanding, far beyond her years. "That is why you are alone." "That's why I was alone," Jack corrected, the distinction surprising him. "Things change, I guess." Later that afternoon, Jack found himself on the porch, watching Ayana work with the horses. She had a natural way with them that impressed him, patient, gentle, but firm when needed. Sage, who rarely let strangers near, was nuzzling Ayana's palm as she whispered to the mare in Apache. "You're good with them," Jack called out. Ayana smiled, the first truly unguarded expression he'd seen from her. "My grandfather taught me. He said horses and people, they understand each other if you listen right." As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Jack made a decision that would change both their lives. "Ayana," he called out. "Come here for a minute." She approached cautiously, still learning to read his moods and intentions. "I've been thinking," Jack said, his weathered hands gripping the porch railing. "You want to stay here, learn to read, make your own choices. Well, this place could use someone who understands horses the way you do." Hope flickered in her dark eyes, but she remained cautious. "You would let me stay?" "More than that," Jack said, the words coming from a place in his heart he thought had died with Sarah. "You want a family that won't sell you off like livestock? Well, I could use a daughter, a real one." Tears gathered in Ayana's eyes as she processed the magnitude of what he was offering. Not just shelter, not just safety, but belonging. A place in the world where she could grow into whoever she was meant to be. "You would be my father," she whispered. Jack's voice was thick with emotion. "If you'll have an old cowboy who doesn't know much about raising girls, but's willing to learn." For the first time since she'd arrived, Ayana stepped forward and hugged him, her small arms wrapping around his waist with desperate gratitude. Jack's arms came up to hold her, and he felt something in his chest that had been frozen for 3 years finally begin to thaw. The riders appeared on the horizon like a dust storm, 7 Apache men on horseback, their silhouettes sharp against the morning sky. Jack had been expecting this day for months, ever since word had spread through the territory that a white rancher was harboring a runaway Apache girl. "Ayana," Jack called out, his voice steady despite the tension coiling in his chest. "Come inside." She emerged from the barn where she'd been feeding the horses, took one look at the approaching riders, and went rigid. Jack could see the fear war with defiance in her dark eyes. She'd grown stronger in the 6 months since she'd arrived, more confident, but these men represented everything she'd fled from. "Is it them?" Jack asked, though he already knew the answer. "My father," Ayana whispered, pointing to the lead rider, "and my uncle. They come for me." Jack's hand instinctively moved to the rifle propped against the porch post, but Ayana caught his wrist. "No guns," she said firmly. "That will only make it worse." The riders approached at a steady pace, their horses' hooves raising clouds of red dust. Jack could make out the lead man now, tall, weathered, with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. Ayana's father, he realized, seeing the resemblance in the set of their shoulders, the proud tilt of their heads. "Stay behind me," Jack murmured, as the riders pulled up in front of the house. Ayana's father dismounted, his eyes never leaving his daughter's face. When he spoke, it was in rapid Apache, his tone angry and commanding. Jack didn't need to understand the words to recognize the fury of a father whose authority had been challenged. Ayana responded in the same language, her voice respectful but firm. Back and forth they went, their words growing more heated with each exchange. Jack stood silent, feeling helpless and out of place in this family drama, but determined to protect the girl who'd become his daughter in every way that mattered. Finally, Ayana's father turned to Jack, his English heavily accented but clear. "You steal my daughter. You teach her white ways, make her forget her people." "I didn't steal nobody," Jack replied, his voice calm but unwavering. "She came here scared and hungry. I gave her food and shelter, same as I'd do for any child in need." "She's promised," one of the other men said, sliding down from his horse. Jack recognized the cruel set of his mouth, the possessive way he looked at Ayana. This had to be the man she was meant to marry. "Bride price is paid. She belongs to me." "She don't belong to nobody but herself," Jack said, his temper starting to rise, "and she's made it clear she don't want no part of your arrangement." The man stepped forward aggressively, but Ayana's father held up a hand, stopping him. The older Apache studied Jack with shrewd eyes, taking in the defensive stance, the protective way he positioned himself between them and Ayana. "You care for her," he said finally. It wasn't a question. "Like she was my own blood," Jack replied without hesitation. Ayana's father said something in Apache to his companions, then walked closer to Jack. "My daughter, she tells me you lost a child." Jack's jaw tightened. 3 years ago, fever took her. "And now you think my daughter can fill that empty place in your heart?" The question hit harder than Jack expected. He glanced back at Ayanna, who was watching the exchange with wide, frightened eyes, ready to run or fight, depending on how this played out. "No," Jack said quietly, "nothing can replace what I lost. But that girl there, she's made her own place. Different, but just as real." For a long moment, the two fathers stared at each other across the cultural divide that separated them. Then Ayanna stepped forward, speaking to her father in Apache, her voice steady and clear. Jack could hear the determination in her tone, even if he couldn't understand the words. Her father listened without interruption, his expression growing more troubled with each sentence. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time, studying his daughter's face as if seeing her clearly for the first time. "She says you teach her to read," he said finally to Jack. "She says you treat her with respect, ask her opinion on things." "She's got a good mind," Jack replied. "Be ashamed to waste it." "She also says," the older man's voice grew heavy, "that you never try to make her forget she is Apache, that you ask her to teach you about our ways." That was true. Jack had been fascinated by the stories Ayanna shared about her people, the connection to the land, the complex social structures he'd never understood. Through her, he'd begun to see the Apache not as savage enemies, but as people with their own rich culture and traditions. "She's proud of who she is," Jack said. "Wouldn't want to change that." The prospective husband said something sharp in Apache, gesturing angrily at Ayanna. Her father snapped back at him, and Jack caught the dismissive tone, the clear rejection. The man's face darkened with fury, but he didn't argue further. "My daughter is no longer promised," Ayanna's father announced, his decision final. "The bride price will be returned." Relief flooded through Jack, but he could see this wasn't over. There were still questions to be answered, arrangements to be made. "She can stay?" Jack asked. Ayanna's father looked at his daughter one more time, taking in her clean dress, her healthy complexion, the confidence in her bearing that hadn't been there when she'd run away. "She can choose," he said finally. "But she will not forget her people. She will visit, learn the old ways alongside the new ones you teach her." Ayanna nodded eagerly, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, father, I promise." As the Apache riders prepared to leave, Ayanna's father approached Jack one last time. "You take good care of her," he said, extending his hand in the white man's custom. "She is precious." "I know," Jack replied, gripping the offered hand firmly. "I won't let you down." As the dust settled and the riders disappeared back into the desert, Jack put his arm around Ayanna's shoulders, feeling the tremor of relief running through her small frame. "You okay, daughter?" he asked softly. Ayanna looked up at him with eyes bright with tears and hope. "I am home," she said simply. "For the first time in my life, I am truly home." 1 year later, the Morrison Ranch looked like a different place entirely. Where once there had been only the bare necessities of a man living alone, now there were small touches that spoke of family. Wildflowers in mason jars on the kitchen table, books stacked on every available surface, and the sound of laughter echoing across the desert. Jack stood on the porch in the early morning light, watching Ayanna work with a young stallion in the corral. At 18 now, she'd grown into herself, her movements confident and graceful as she guided the horse through its paces. She'd kept her promise to her father, visiting the Apache reservation regularly, learning traditional skills from the elder women, but she'd also thrown herself into the world of books and learning that Jack had opened for her. "Morning, Papa Jack," she called out, using the name she'd settled on, a blend of English and the Apache word for father that felt right to both of them. "Morning, daughter. How's Thunder coming along?" "He's stubborn, but he's got a good heart," she replied, patting the stallion's neck affectionately. "Reminds me of someone else I know." Jack chuckled, recognizing the gentle teasing. Their relationship had evolved into something beautiful, part father-daughter, part teacher-student, part partners in the business of making the ranch thrive. Ayana had proven to have an exceptional gift with horses, and word had spread throughout the territory. They now had more business than Jack could handle alone. "Mail came yesterday," Jack said, holding up an envelope, "from that school back east." Ayana's eyes widened as she climbed out of the corral, dusting off her hands. Over the past year, Jack had been corresponding with a teacher's college in Massachusetts, trying to find a way for Ayana to get the formal education she craved without having to leave everything behind. "What do they say?" she asked, trying to hide the hope in her voice. Jack opened the letter slowly, his reading still careful after all these years. "They want to offer you a place in their correspondence program. You'd study at home, take examinations when their representatives come through Arizona territory. Says here you could earn a teaching certificate in 3 years." The joy that lit up Ayana's face was worth all the months of letters and negotiations. She threw her arms around Jack, spinning in a circle of pure happiness. "I can really become a teacher?" she asked breathlessly. "More than that," Jack said, his own smile broad. "Letter says if you do well in the correspondence courses, they'd consider you for their advanced program. You could go back east for a year, get a full college education." For a moment, Ayana's face clouded with uncertainty. "But that would mean leaving you, leaving the ranch." Jack's chest tightened at the thought, but he forced himself to smile. "Daughter, the whole point of raising a child right is preparing them to fly on their own. Besides, it's only a year, and I'll still be here when you get back. You promise?" "I promise," Jack said, meaning it with every fiber of his being. "This will always be your home." Later that afternoon, they rode out to check on the cattle, following a routine they'd developed over the months. The Arizona landscape stretched endlessly around them, red rocks and desert scrub under a sky so blue it hurt to look at. "Jack," Ayana said suddenly, her voice serious. "Do you ever regret it? Taking me in, I mean. Your life was simpler before." Jack reined in his horse, considering the question carefully. "Simpler, maybe, but not better. Not by a long shot. Sometimes I think about what would have happened if I hadn't hidden in your barn that day," Ayana continued. "If I'd kept running, or if you'd turned me away." "But you didn't keep running, and I didn't turn you away," Jack replied. "That's what matters. Sometimes life gives you exactly what you need, even when you don't know you need it." They rode in comfortable silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. The sun was beginning to set, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson. "There's something I want to show you," Ayana said, steering her horse toward a rocky outcropping they'd never explored before. They climbed up the red sandstone, their horses picking their way carefully over the uneven terrain. At the top, Ayana led Jack to a sheltered alcove where ancient petroglyphs covered the rock face, spirals and animals and human figures telling stories that stretched back centuries. "My grandfather brought me here when I was small," Ayana explained, running her fingers over the carved symbols. "He said this was a place where different peoples had come to leave their mark, to say, 'We were here, we mattered.'" She reached into the pocket of her worn jacket and pulled out a stub of charcoal, its edges softened from use. With quiet purpose, she moved toward a broad, sun-bleached section of sandstone nestled against the edge of the bluff. The surface was smooth, shaped by wind and time, a canvas waiting for memory. Kneeling beside it, Ayana began to draw, her strokes slow and deliberate. Simple figures began to emerge beneath her fingers. First, the outline of a tall man with a wide-brimmed hat, then a smaller figure beside him, unmistakably a girl, hair flowing down her back. Beside them, she sketched 2 horses, one clearly older, heavier, the other more lithe and spirited. Despite the rough medium, there was a tenderness in the way she placed them side by side, as if even in charcoal they needed to be near each other. Jack stood a few paces behind her, watching silently as the image took shape. The fading light of dusk cast a golden hue on the rock, and the charcoal marks seemed to glow faintly in its warmth. He felt something stir deep in his chest, a blend of wonder, sorrow, and a gratitude too large for words. "What are you doing?" he asked quietly, his voice barely more than a breath carried on the desert wind. Ayana didn't look up, still focused on the drawing. "Leaving our mark," she said, her tone steady, reverent. "So someday when the winds have shifted and the ranch is dust, people will know that Jack Morrison and Ayana were here, and they were family." She added more details now. The lines of the horses' manes, the tilt of Jack's hat, the joining of the figures' hands. Each line spoke not just of what they looked like, but what they meant to each other. Ayana paused now and then to blow gently on the surface, clearing bits of stone dust from her work. There was something ceremonial in her movements, as if she were honoring a sacred bond. Jack felt his throat tighten. His hands, so steady on reins and rifle, now trembled slightly at his sides. She didn't need to say more. That word, family, rang through him louder than any thunder. When she finally stood, brushing the dust from her knees, she looked at the image in silence. Jack came to her side, following her gaze. It was a simple drawing, childlike in its execution. And yet, it held everything: memory, belonging, legacy. "There," she said at last, a small smile playing on her lips. "Now, we're part of the story of this place." Jack nodded, unable to speak. Behind them, the desert stretched on in quiet reverence, and above them, the first stars began to bloom in the darkening sky. Whatever came next, the world beyond the ranch, the days still unwritten, this would remain, a mark carved not in stone, but in love. As they made their way back down the rocks, Jack felt a peace he hadn't known since Sarah died. The future stretched ahead of them, full of possibilities: Ayana's education, her dreams of teaching, maybe even a family of her own someday. But whatever came, they would face it together, bound not by blood but by something deeper: the choice to love and protect each other against all odds. Back at the ranch that evening, they sat on the porch as stars began to appear in the vast desert sky. Ayana was reading aloud from one of her books, a habit that had developed early on, helping Jack improve his own reading while she practiced her English. "Papa Jack?" she said suddenly, looking up from the pages. "Thank you." "For what, daughter?" "For seeing me," Ayana said simply. "That first day in the barn, you could have seen a runaway, a problem, a burden, but you saw a daughter instead." Jack reached over and squeezed her hand, his weathered fingers gentle against her smooth skin. "And you could have seen a lonely old cowboy with nothing to offer, but you saw a father instead." Udil, as the desert night settled around them, wrapped in a veil of cool stillness and threaded with the distant howls of coyotes and the soft flutter of night birds' wings, Jack Morrison sat quietly on the porch, his gaze drifting across the dark horizon. The stars had begun to pierce the velvet sky, ancient and steady, watching over the vast silence of the land. He pulled his coat tighter, not against the cold, but as if shielding himself from the weight of memory. 3 years ago, he'd been a broken man, hollowed out by grief, dragging himself through days that felt more like punishment than passage. He had lived in solitude, content to let the world forget him as he tried to forget it. Then she had come, barefoot, frightened, wild-eyed, and everything had changed. A young Apache girl with more courage in her silence than most men had in words. She hadn't spoken much at first, but her presence had filled the emptiness in him, like sunlight through cracks in an old barn. Now she sat beside him, tall and strong, a quiet fire in her eyes that had not dimmed with time, only grown wiser. He still remembered the day he'd called her daughter for the first time, how her breath caught, how the earth itself seemed to pause. From that moment on, she had been his family, not by blood, but by every measure that truly mattered. Tomorrow, they would begin preparations for her correspondence courses, the first step towards something greater, a life that would stretch far beyond this dusty corner of the world. She would study, dream, and eventually leave for places with tall buildings and unfamiliar skies. And yet Jack knew with the certainty of stone and root that she would always come back. Not just to the ranch, but to this, the quiet bond they'd built, the rhythm of life they had learned to share. The wind stirred again, brushing across the porch like a whisper, carrying the scent of sagebrush and the distant metallic promise of rain. From far off, thunder muttered over the low mountains, a deep, steady voice that spoke of storms and change. Jack tilted his head, listening, not with fear, but with respect. He knew the desert. It changed with time, but it never forgot. Change was coming, as it always did. Seasons would shift, people would move on, and the world would try to remake itself over and over. But some things, love, loyalty, and the quiet strength of chosen family, those were carved into something deeper. They endured not despite time, but because of it. He turned to her, his arm resting gently around her shoulders. She leaned into him, saying nothing, because nothing needed to be said. Above them, the stars shimmered. Below them, the earth waited. And somewhere in the dark, the first drop of rain struck dry earth with a sound like a heartbeat. Jack Morrison smiled and waited for the storm.